Are you deaf, or just fundamentally incapable of comprehending the law? Judge Marcus Thorne's voice echoed like a whip cracking across the silent courtroom. People like you come into my court, dressed in thrift store rags, expecting handouts and sympathy. Well, you get neither here. Eleanor stood frozen, her hands gripping the wooden podium. The gallery snickered. I am holding you in contempt. Marcus roared, his face flushed with tyrannical power. Bailiff, handcuff this woman. But as the officer approached, Eleanor didn't flinch. Instead, a cold, terrifying smile crept across her face. The Honorable Judge, Marcus Thorne, ruled over Courtroom 302 of the Cook County Circuit Court like a feudal lord presiding over a domain of peasants. For 15 years, Marcus had cultivated a reputation that preceded him through the marble halls of the downtown Chicago courthouse. He was known among the city's elite as a fixer, a man who protected the interests of the wealthy developers and the politically connected. But to the poor, the marginalized, and the unconnected, he was known simply as the executioner. Marcus was a man who reveled in the power dynamics of his position. He enjoyed the way people trembled when his heavy oak gavel struck the sounding block. He savored the absolute authority he held over people's livelihoods, their homes, and their freedoms. On this particular Tuesday morning, the air in the courtroom was thick with the suffocating heat of an aging HVAC system and the palpable anxiety of the desperate citizens waiting for their names to be called. Marcus sat elevated on his mahogany bench, draped in his sweeping black robes, looking down his sharp, aristocratic nose at the docket. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his posture rigidly arrogant. He viewed the people before him not as human beings seeking justice, but as minor annoyances wasting his valuable time he would much rather spend at his exclusive country club in the northern suburbs. When the bailiff called the case of Stratton Holdings versus Vance, Marcus barely looked up from his legal pad. Step forward, he barked, his voice dripping with preemptive boredom. From the back of the gallery, a black woman quietly made her way down the center aisle. This was Eleanor Vance. She wore a simple, faded beige cardigan over a modest, unbranded navy skirt. Her hair was pulled back into a practical, unpretentious bun, and she carried a battered, faux leather tote bag that looked like it had seen a decade of daily commutes on the CTA Red Line. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, and walked with a slow, deliberate cadence that Marcus instantly misinterpreted as the hesitation of the uneducated. As Eleanor reached the defendant's podium, Marcus finally raised his eyes. It took him less than 3 seconds to profile her. He saw the cheap cardigan, the worn shoes, and her skin color, and immediately placed her into a neat, prejudiced mental box, another pro se litigant, completely ignorant of the law, who was going to waste his morning complaining about a system she couldn't comprehend. Opposite her stood Richard Caldwell, the slick, high-priced attorney representing Stratton Holdings. Caldwell wore a custom-tailored Italian suit that cost more than Eleanor's apparent annual salary. He shot Marcus a knowing, conspiratorial smirk, a silent acknowledgement between two men who understood how the game was played. "State your name for the record," Marcus ordered, leaning into his microphone so his voice boomed unnecessarily loud through the courtroom speakers. "Eleanor Vance, Your Honor," she replied. Her voice was steady, calm, and modulated, but Marcus wasn't listening to her tone, he was already dismissing her presence. "Miss Vance," Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples as if she had already given him a migraine. "You are representing yourself? A grave mistake. The law is not a reality television show, but let us proceed. Mr. Caldwell, enlighten the court as to why we are here, so we can expedite this inevitable conclusion." Eleanor opened her battered tote bag and began meticulously arranging a thick stack of manila folders on the podium. She didn't look intimidated, she didn't look nervous. She simply watched Judge Marcus Thorne with a pair of dark, observant eyes that seemed to absorb every microscopic detail of the room. Marcus, blinded by his own hubris, failed to recognize the terrifying stillness of a predator waiting for its prey to step into a trap. "Your Honor," Attorney Caldwell began, his voice practically oozing with faux sympathy. "This is a straightforward matter of a mechanic's lien and subsequent foreclosure. My client, Stratton Holdings, was contracted to perform extensive foundational and structural renovations on the defendant's property, a historic brownstone located in the Bronzeville neighborhood. The work was completed over 6 months ago. The defendant, Miss Vance, has stubbornly refused to pay the outstanding balance of $85,000. My client has followed every protocol under the Illinois Mechanics Lien Act, 770 ILCS 60, and we are now seeking a summary judgment to seize the property to satisfy the debt. Marcus nodded sagely, as if Caldwell had just recited poetry. In truth, Marcus knew exactly what this case was. Stratton Holdings was a shell company, operating out of a P.O. box in Delaware. The company was quietly managed by a labyrinth of proxy directors, but the ultimate beneficiary was Marcus's brother-in-law. This was their modus operandi: target aging, valuable properties in gentrifying neighborhoods owned by elderly or vulnerable minorities, slap fraudulent construction liens on the titles for work that was never done, and use Marcus's courtroom to rubber stamp the theft. It was a highly lucrative, perfectly legal-looking racket. Seems clear enough to me, Marcus said, shuffling his papers. Services rendered, payment denied. A classic case of attempting to cheat hard-working businesses. Eleanor cleared her throat softly. Your Honor, if I may speak? Marcus rolled his eyes dramatically, glancing at the court reporter. Make it quick, Miss Vance. The law doesn't care about your personal financial difficulties. I am not experiencing financial difficulties, Your Honor, Eleanor said evenly, opening her first folder. I am refusing to pay because the renovations were never performed. Stratton Holdings never set foot on my property. Furthermore, the contract Mr. Caldwell submitted to this court contains a forged signature. I have here a forensic handwriting analysis, as well as date-stamped surveillance footage of my property proving no construction crews were present during the dates claimed. She lifted a thick binder, preparing to hand it to the bailiff to pass to the judge. Objection! Caldwell shouted, standing up smoothly. These documents were not properly submitted during discovery, Your Honor. This is a desperate, 11th-hour ambush by a woman who realizes she is legally cornered. Sustained, Marcus snapped immediately, not even looking at Eleanor's binder. Miss Vance, you cannot just waltz into my courtroom and wave random pieces of paper around. There are rules of evidence. LexisNexis is full of case law detailing exactly how you are failing right now. I will not accept your little scrapbook into the official record. Your Honor, Eleanor countered, her voice remaining impossibly level. Under the Illinois Code of Civil Procedure, Section 2 to 1005, I am permitted to submit affidavits and sworn evidence in opposition to a motion for summary judgment prior to the hearing. These were filed with the clerk 3 days ago. Marcus blinked, slightly taken aback by her precise citation of the statute. But his surprise quickly mutated into deep, acidic anger. How dare this woman attempt to lecture him on his own turf? He leaned aggressively over the bench, his face turning a mottled shade of red. Are you attempting to practice law in my courtroom, Miss Vance? Marcus growled, his voice dropping an octave into a menacing register. Did you spend 10 minutes on Google last night and suddenly think you passed the bar? You have no standing to interpret the civil code to me. I am merely pointing out that my evidence is legally admissible, Judge Thorne, Eleanor replied, holding his furious gaze without a single tremor of fear. If you refuse to look at it, you are denying me due process under the law. Marcus gripped his gavel, his knuckles turning white. The audacity of this woman was unprecedented. Usually, by this point, pro se defendants were either in tears or stammering apologies. Eleanor Vance was doing neither. She was standing there, in her thrift store clothes, challenging the absolute authority of the Cook County Kingmaker. I decide what is admissible in this room. Marcus thundered. And I have decided that your fabricated conspiracy theories are inadmissible. Your objection is overruled. The evidence is barred. Now, unless you have $85,000 in a cashier's check in that ratty bag of yours, I suggest you prepare to pack your belongings. The courtroom was dead silent. The gallery, filled with other defendants waiting their turn, watched in paralyzed horror. They recognized the mood Judge Thorne was in. It was the mood that destroyed lives. Marcus, feeling the eyes of his audience upon him, decided that simply ruling against Eleanor wasn't enough. Her calm defiance was an insult that demanded a public flogging. He needed to break her spirit, to remind her and everyone else in the room exactly where the power resided. "Let's talk about your so-called evidence, Miss Vance," Marcus said, his voice dripping with condescension. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "You come in here with forged handwriting analyses and fake security tapes. It's pathetic, really. It shows a fundamental lack of respect for the intelligence of this court. Did you even graduate high school, Miss Vance?" Eleanor didn't blink. "I have a thorough education, Your Honor." "Oh, a thorough education," Marcus mocked, looking over at Attorney Caldwell, who snickered obediently. "Was that from the University of the Streets? Let me explain something to you in simple terms, since complex legal concepts seem to bounce off you. You cannot sign a contract, regret it later, and then cry fraud to get out of paying your bills. People like you, and we see your kind in here every single day, always want to play the victim. You want the rewards of property ownership without the responsibility. You expect the system to bend over backward to accommodate your financial illiteracy." Eleanor's grip on the podium tightened slightly, the only outward sign that his words were landing. "Your Honor, the contract is fraudulent. If you would simply review Exhibit A. I told you, I am not looking at your finger painting," Marcus shouted, slamming his palm on the desk. "You stand there in those clothes, carrying that bag, and expect me to believe you have the resources to hire a forensic analyst? You're a liar, Miss Vance. A blatant, desperate liar trying to save a house you clearly cannot afford." He pointed a thick, manicured finger at her. "You are making a mockery of the judicial system. You are wasting taxpayer dollars. Honestly, it's a disgrace that people like you are even allowed to clog up my docket with this nonsense. You bring a profound stench of incompetence into my courtroom." Eleanor let his words hang in the air, allowing the court reporter's fingers to fly across the stenograph, capturing every vile, prejudiced syllable Marcus spat out. She wanted him to feel comfortable. She wanted his arrogance to reach its absolute zenith so that the impending fall would be all the more devastating. "Is that your official assessment of my character, Your Honor?" Eleanor asked quietly. "It is my official assessment of your sheer ignorance," Marcus retorted, taking the bait completely. "You don't know the law. You don't know how the world works. You are a small, insignificant woman trying to play a game meant for adults. Now, are you going to stop wasting my time, or do I need to hold you in contempt to force you to shut your mouth?" Attorney Caldwell polished his designer glasses, hiding a massive grin. It was a slaughter. He didn't even have to argue his case. Judge Thorne was doing all the heavy lifting, brutally dismantling the defendant's dignity piece by piece. "I am merely trying to ensure the record reflects your reasoning for denying my evidence," Eleanor said, writing a quick note on her legal pad. "My reasoning is that I am the judge, and you are a nobody," Marcus sneered, adjusting his black robes to puff up his chest. "That is the only reason you need to comprehend. You are out of your depth, out of your league, and out of luck." Marcus had reached his threshold. He was tired of Eleanor's unnerving stare. He picked up his pen and pulled the final summary judgment order toward him. "I have heard enough," Marcus announced, his voice echoing with finality. "The defendant has failed to present any admissible evidence to contradict the plaintiff's claims. Furthermore, the defendant has shown a shocking lack of decorum and a fundamental inability to grasp court procedure. Therefore, I am granting summary judgment in favor of Stratton Holdings." He signed his name with a violent, flourishing scrawl. "Miss Vance, you have 48 hours to vacate the premises located in Bronzeville. If you are not gone by Thursday morning, the sheriff's department will forcibly remove you and your belongings, and the property will be transferred to the plaintiff to satisfy the lien." "Your Honor," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the tension like a razor. "I strongly advise you to reconsider signing that order." The courtroom collectively gasped. Even the court reporter paused for a fraction of a second. "You do not tell Judge Marcus Thorne to reconsider." Marcus slowly lowered his pen. The veins in his neck were bulging against his collar, his face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He felt completely, utterly disrespected. Are you deaf, or just fundamentally incapable of comprehending the law? Marcus roared, the words exploding from his chest. People like you come into my court, dressed in thrift store rags, expecting handouts and sympathy. Well, you get neither here. Eleanor stood her ground. I expect justice, Judge Thorne. And I expect a judge who is not actively colluding with the plaintiff's shell company to steal real estate. Caldwell jumped up, his face pale. Objection. Defamation. Your Honor, she is slandering my client and this court. I am holding you in contempt. Marcus screamed, completely losing control, his spit flying across the bench. He slammed his gavel down so hard the wooden handle nearly splintered. Bailiff, take this woman into custody immediately. Handcuff her. I am sentencing you to 30 days in the county jail for criminal contempt of court. Let's see how smart you feel sitting in a concrete cell. The heavy-set bailiff, looking slightly nervous but bound by duty, unclipped his handcuffs and began walking down the aisle toward Eleanor. The gallery was in a state of muted panic. They were witnessing a judge legally execute a citizen over a bruised ego. Ma'am, please put your hands behind your back, the bailiff said gruffly as he approached the podium. Eleanor didn't move her hands to her back. Instead, she reached into her battered tote bag one final time. Bailiff, Eleanor said, and for the first time, her voice changed. The quiet, polite tone of a pro se defendant vanished entirely. It was replaced by a voice of sheer, unadulterated, commanding authority. It was a voice used to commanding rooms far more powerful than this one. Take one more step, and I will have you federally indicted for assaulting a United States judge. The bailiff froze in his tracks. The handcuffs dangled uselessly from his fingers. Marcus let out a sharp, derisive bark of laughter, though it sounded slightly manic. A federal judge? Oh, she's lost her mind. She's completely insane. Bailiff, ignore her delusions and cuff her. Eleanor slowly unzipped a hidden compartment in her bag. She pulled out a small, heavy leather wallet and flipped it open, holding it high for the bailiff, Mr. Caldwell, and Judge Marcus Thorne to see. The fluorescent lights caught the gleam of the solid gold shield embedded in the leather, right next to a severe, official Department of Justice photo ID. My name is not merely Eleanor Vance, she said, her voice ringing off the marble walls, echoing with absolute supremacy. I am the Honorable Eleanor Vance Sterling. I am the Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. And, as of 3 months ago, I was appointed by the Attorney General to head the Department of Justice's Joint Task Force on Judicial Corruption. The silence that fell over courtroom 302 was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a bomb detonating, leaving a vacuum in its wake. The color drained from Marcus Thorne's face so fast he looked as though he might physically collapse. His arrogant sneer dissolved into a mask of pure, unfiltered terror. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The gavel slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered onto the desk. Attorney Caldwell staggered backward, his knees literally giving out as he collapsed into his chair, his expensive briefcase spilling open onto the floor. The bailiff took 3 rapid steps backward, holstering his handcuffs as if they were made of fire. Eleanor reached up and pulled the simple hair ties from her bun, letting her hair fall freely. She slipped off the cheap beige cardigan, revealing a tailored, pristine white blouse underneath. In seconds, the illusion of the helpless, uneducated victim vanished, replaced by one of the most powerful legal minds in the federal judiciary. You can't be, Marcus finally stammered, his voice reduced to a pathetic, reedy whisper. He stared at the golden shield. He knew what it was. Every judge knew what it was. The property. The records showed it belonged to an E. Vance. It belonged to my late grandmother, Eleanor stated, her eyes locking onto Marcus with the intensity of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. When she passed away, she left the Bronzeville property to me, and when I went to clear the title, I discovered a fraudulent mechanics lien filed by a company called Stratton Holdings. A company that, oddly enough, seemed to win 100% of its default judgments in this specific courtroom. Marcus swallowed hard, sweat suddenly pouring down his forehead, ruining his perfect hair. Your Honor. Judge Vance, Sterling. There has been a terrible misunderstanding. I did not realize who you were. If you had known I was a federal appellate judge, you would have treated me with respect. Eleanor cut him off, her voice cracking like thunder. That is precisely the problem, Marcus. Justice is supposed to be blind. It is not supposed to require a gold badge to receive a fair hearing. I sat here and listened as you mocked my perceived education. I listened as you weaponized your authority against a citizen you believed was poor and defenseless. I watched you rubber stamp the theft of a home because you thought the victim couldn't fight back. I was just following the law. Marcus pleaded, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of his bench. The plaintiff presented a contract. You were running a racketeering enterprise, Eleanor corrected him coldly. She picked up her thick binder, the one Marcus had refused to look at. You see, Marcus, if you had bothered to look at my finger painting as you called it, you wouldn't have just found a forensic handwriting analysis. Exhibit C contains the financial routing numbers for Stratton Holdings offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Accounts that wire monthly dividends to an LLC registered to your wife's maiden name. Caldwell let out a strangled gasp and buried his face in his hands. He knew it was over. Furthermore, Eleanor continued, her voice merciless, Exhibit D contains 72 pages of wiretap transcripts provided by the FBI, detailing phone calls between you and Mr. Caldwell, discussing exactly which minority-owned properties you were going to target next. Marcus looked frantically around the courtroom, his eyes wide, searching for an exit, a sympathetic face, a way out of the nightmare. There was none. The gallery was staring at him, realizing that the tyrant who had terrorized their community was currently being unmasked and destroyed before their very eyes. This is entrapment. Marcus yelled desperately, grasping at legal straws, his voice cracking hysterically. You came in here under false pretenses. You set me up. Entrapment requires me to coerce you into committing a crime you would not otherwise commit, Eleanor replied smoothly, closing her binder. I didn't force you to deny my evidence. I didn't force you to mock my clothing. I didn't force you to illegally grant summary judgment to your brother-in-law's shell company. You did all of that on your own, Marcus. You did it because you thought I was a nobody. You did it because you are corrupt to your very core. Eleanor turned her gaze toward the back of the courtroom and gave a subtle nod. Instantly, 8 people who had been sitting quietly in the gallery, people who looked like ordinary citizens waiting for their traffic tickets, stood up in unison. They reached inside their jackets and pulled out FBI badges, letting them hang around their necks. 2 of them quickly moved to secure the courtroom doors. 4 others walked briskly down the center aisle, their eyes locked on the bench. Special Agent Miller, Eleanor said, addressing the lead agent. You have the federal arrest warrants? Yes, Your Honor, Agent Miller replied, stepping past the barricade. He looked up at the trembling judge. Marcus Thorne, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, judicial corruption, racketeering under the RICO Act, and deprivation of civil rights under color of law. No, no, please, Marcus whimpered, tears streaking down his flushed face. The arrogant, untouchable king of Courtroom 302 was gone, replaced by a broken, terrified old man. He looked at Eleanor, pleading with his eyes. Eleanor. Judge Sterling. Please. My reputation. My pension. We are colleagues. We can sort this out in chambers. Don't do this to me in public. You lost the right to be called my colleague the moment you sold your oath of office, Eleanor said, her face devoid of any sympathy. You wanted to make a public spectacle today, Marcus. You wanted to humiliate a black woman to feed your monstrous ego. Well, the spectacle is yours. Drink it in. Agent Miller walked up the steps to the bench. Stand up, Mr. Thorne. Put your hands behind your back. Marcus sobbed as the federal agent grabbed his wrists. The heavy metal handcuffs clicked shut with a loud, final snap, the very same sound Marcus had eagerly anticipated hearing on Eleanor's wrists just minutes before. Take off his robes, Eleanor commanded. He doesn't deserve to wear them. Agent Miller stripped the heavy black robes from Marcus's shoulders, leaving him standing in his sweaty shirt and suspenders, looking small, pathetic, and entirely human. At the defense table, 2 other agents were already pulling a weeping attorney Caldwell out of his chair, placing him in cuffs. The slick lawyer was sobbing about a plea deal, offering to testify against Marcus before he was even out of the room. The aftermath of that Tuesday morning sent shockwaves through the entire Illinois judicial system. When federal marshals escorted Marcus Thorne out of the courthouse, it wasn't through a private back entrance. The DOJ had tipped off the local news affiliates. Marcus was forced to do the perp walk out the front doors of the Cook County Circuit Court, past a gauntlet of flashing cameras, microphones, and cheering citizens, many of whom were victims of his past fraudulent rulings. The footage of the once mighty judge, stripped of his robes, weeping in handcuffs, was broadcast on every network from CNN to local Chicago access channels. The trial was swift and brutal. Eleanor Van Sterling did not recuse herself from the DOJ Oversight Committee. She personally ensured the prosecution had every piece of evidence necessary. Stripped of his power and connections, Marcus found himself completely abandoned by his wealthy developer friends, who were scrambling to save themselves from federal indictments. Marcus Thorne was convicted on 14 counts of federal corruption, wire fraud, and racketeering. The sentencing judge, a colleague who deeply despised Marcus's stain on the judiciary, showed no mercy. Marcus was stripped of his law license, his lavish judicial pension was seized to pay restitution to his victims, and he was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. Karma, when it finally arrived, was poetic in its cruelty. Marcus was assigned to a federal correctional facility in Indiana. His daily job assignment was scrubbing the floors of the prison cafeteria, a far cry from the mahogany bench and country clubs he once ruled. The man who had mocked Eleanor's thrift store clothes now wore an oversized, faded orange jumpsuit every single day, his identity reduced to a string of numbers printed on his chest. Meanwhile, Judge Eleanor Van Sterling spearheaded a comprehensive review of every single case Marcus Thorne had presided over in the last decade. Using her authority, she reversed dozens of fraudulent foreclosures and wrongful convictions, returning stolen properties including her grandmother's beloved Bronzeville brownstone back to their rightful owners. She hung the gavel Marcus had dropped in her own chambers at the federal appellate court. It wasn't a trophy. It was a daily reminder. A reminder that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that the robes of justice are meant to be a shield for the vulnerable, not a weapon for the wicked. And somewhere in a federal penitentiary, an arrogant man mopped a concrete floor, haunted every night by the terrifying, calm smile of the woman he thought he could break, but who ended up breaking him instead. Wow, what an incredible story of absolute justice. Judge Marcus thought he was the untouchable king of the courtroom, ready to humiliate a vulnerable woman for his own twisted ego and greed. But he learned the hard way that you should never judge a book by its cover, especially when that cover is hiding a federal appellate judge ready to bring down the hammer of karma. Seeing him stripped of his robes and led out in handcuffs is the ultimate reminder that nobody is above the law, and corruption always catches up to you. If you loved seeing this arrogant tyrant get exactly what he deserved, make sure to smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Share this video with someone who loves a good karma story.